So what we're going to do is dig into the kind of curriculum development and the series of lessons and questions that we've got with the Ministry of Eco Education. And what we're going to have is a bit of a discussion about the process of creating those and some of the things that we think stand out and are really special about those series of lessons. So over the last few years, we'd pulled together loads of different teaching materials, resources, and opportunities into series of lessons that were framed around these big questions. And we've done a lot of work around the primary curriculum. And I think we had something like 30 or 40 questions framed at the primary curriculum. What we needed to do was to finish some of those, and we also wanted to really finish a lot of the work shifting it towards Key Stage 3. And I think you've been a key part in bringing other aspects of subject knowledge from other spheres, um, yeah, and kind of also just your own experience to help inform and develop these.
So I think what I found really exciting about coming across you guys and kind of delving into the Ministry of Eco Education's big questions was just how vast all of these big questions were and how many kind of themes and topics they covered um, across what I currently see as a kind of quite broken curriculum and that doesn't actually allow for these conversations. And I think they're conversations that young people and teachers are craving to have. So I'll talk a little bit about how I kind of spent some time just kind of understanding what you've done already. And I think the key part of that for me was understanding these different themes that you've got. So you've got these 7 different themes. So, for example, things like society, waste, food. And it's kind of really key in understanding aspects of the climate and ecological crisis. And I think these are areas which are often overlooked across most subjects and across kind of primary and secondary. And I think these questions do a really good job in kind of having an all-encompassing experience for a student to actually understand the world that we're in and the world that they'll be living in as adults. So I'll talk a little bit about a question that I started off with in the kind of a couple of months ago. This was a Key Stage 2 question, and it was, what is climate justice? Now, I found this one really exciting because this is a conversation that, again, I've had with adults and I've begun to have even with A-level students. But it was a really interesting and kind of new concept to begin to bring into a Key Stage 2 classroom. So first of all, I began to look at what your SDG links were. So I think it's really important that you guys have incorporated the Sustainable Development Goals. And this one looks at the kind of climate action and peace, justice, and strong institutions. And I think that having these concepts interwoven into the way that we teach is a really good way of actually ensuring we achieve the SDGs. I think it's really easy for them to be often seen as like really separate to who we are and separate to kind of our journey as a kind of as humanity to dealing with the climate and ecological crises, but kind of having them interwoven into the way that you teach, I think, is going to be really important in giving students the skills and the knowledge that they need for the future that they're facing. So with this, I kind of then ended up really playing around with the questions that meant that the kind of big inquiry question could be answered. So I started off really actually on paper. I was thinking about kind of what content does a student need to be able to answer that question, and kind of came up with this kind of huge mind map that then allowed me to think about all the different components that will allow a young person to answer that question. So some of the questions are kind of really simple, kind of what is climate justice? But then it's kind of broken down into different aspects as well. So who will the climate change impact the most? What can we learn from the global south? Should we aim for equality? How can we make it fairer? What could a just world look like? What could you do to support climate justice? And what does climate justice mean to you? And I think these questions all really allow kind of the chance for students and teachers to kind of delve in deeply into kind of what climate justice is globally, and really think about how they can be a part in causing climate justice. And again, linking back to the Sustainable Development Goal, but number 13 in particular, the climate action, is that we need young people to feel empowered and to feel knowledgeable to be able to act in the future.
So this one, national curriculum links, English, science, geography, citizenship, and PSHE. I mean, how do you feel about that bringing together at the primary level kind of such a broad mix of subjects and kind of how that works?
I think it's really exciting because I think the huge win of primary schools is that you get to have this really holistic experience of education, that actually you can look at one topic from so many different subject perspectives. And I think that that's something that massively lacks in Key Stage 3 and throughout the secondary school experience. So I think doing this as a secondary teacher has been so exciting to see about how the education system could be done better for older children as well. I think that obviously these skills all interlink and overlap. And by students being able to see where these links occur, that can only benefit them in the future. Because if they're learning things that appear to be separate when they're not, how confusing is that? And they need to understand the kind of complexities and connections that exist within the world that we live in.
How did you go about finding the resources and activities and things to then put into this?
Through a lot of failed Google researches, but also just through looking at kind of known resources. So looking at things by Oxfam, for example, things from the BBC, things from International Women's Day, making sure that the links that we have provided as part of this big inquiry question take people all over the place, where actually perhaps teachers don't have the time to do this research themselves. I definitely know from my time as a teacher, sometimes you just needed to get a lesson together and you needed to kind of pull it and go. And actually the wonderful thing about these questions for teachers is that we've kind of done that work for them, and we've been able to kind of work out how something might be useful for them. Largely, these are kind of lessons or activities or tasks or videos or clips that are kind of ready to go, how the teacher sees fit. But sometimes they might be kind of slightly more for a teacher and helping them to kind of be able to create content for their lesson, which again, I think I can think back to some of my time as a teacher, and I appreciated when the kind of information was there and then I could turn it into whatever activity I wanted to. So hopefully that's what has been achieved with these different resources.
I almost think there's so many key things that the Ministry of Eco Education provides for teachers, but two of them in terms of the lesson activities and resources are we have the time to go exploring and digging for these things, and also that's quite a specialist skill in itself, being able to actually find it and like you say, like knowing which terms to search and kind of how with what I I don't know if this is how it worked for you, but I almost felt like I would get lost in some of this lesson planning where you'd be Googling and find things and that would lead to something else and something else. And, 5, 10 minutes later, you'd have about 20 tabs open and you'd be thinking, God, how can I include all of these things? Like it's all so great. But that I think is one thing, is having the time and the experience, knowledge to be able to find this stuff. But also it's making sure it's kind of good enough quality because I really not sympathize. I kind of understand that you're sort of saying. I do remember being so time pressured that often you'd be the night before planning the final bits of a lesson, and you'd be like, "This is good enough. I'll make it work." Rather than, I think what we've been able to do is really make sure that's the very best thing. And there's also a bit more flexibility and choice for teachers that they can have a look and see there might be 6 or 7 things in a lesson when they might only need to use 2 or 3 of them, and they can pick and choose those.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a real win of kind of what's been produced here. And I think also it's about giving the power to the teachers, that teachers know their classes, whether they're a kind of a primary teacher or a secondary teacher, or even a secondary teacher with multiple classes from the same year group, which I often had, that actually I was always a class where I knew one task would work with that class and another task would work with a different class. And you have to kind of adapt to the people that you have in front of you. And so I think that that's a brilliant part of these resources, is that there are kind of multiple things which can teach the same kind of lesson, I suppose. And I think that's really exciting because, like you said before, you wouldn't have necessarily had the time to look for these things. So hopefully teachers do find that this is something that kind of really adds to the way that they can teach and plan their lessons.
Do you also think there is um, a sort of a style to the type of activities or the variety of activities that we're trying to pull together as well? Because like you've sort of said a little bit, is that these types of activities are not necessarily, it's not a textbook that we're saying read this page and answer these questions. How would you describe the variety or the types of activities?
Well, I think one of the things that I've loved about looking through these different questions and looking especially at the kind of the assessment that we've got for all of these different questions is that kind of inquiry-based learning, where actually it's really down to the student to discover and feel excited about the things that they're learning and feel empowered and that autonomy over what they're learning about. I think that especially kind of during COVID, and I think perhaps that's kind of almost remained in the way that people have taught post-COVID, is that it became quite it wasn't as maybe as interactive and kind of like it didn't have the chance to move around as much, for example. And so this kind of like sense of adventure of doing kind of drama performances or doing kind of mini cops or all of those kind of things that actually really give students memories, and kind of those memories linked to kind of really key information that they're going to need to use in the future, and key skills that they're going to need to use. Because I think often the assessment choices that have been chosen within kind of I'd say normal school are very kind of written based, and that kind of that formative assessment. But actually these are really exciting ways in which we can build new skills for young people, and ensure that they have the communication skills, for example, to work with people and discuss really complex and difficult things that are going to be occurring in our future. And so I think that that's been something that's been brilliant to see throughout these questions.
I think what you're saying as well there is that we've been really explicit in integrating the skills into this as well, so that where each of the assessment outcomes or the thing that the students are working towards has value beyond the classroom and is something that is maybe more creative or kind of performance based. So I'm just looking at this one about which was a question we were just looking at. It was what is climate justice,
What's
wasn't it?
climate justice? Yeah.
Um, And in terms of that one, the sort of assessment is a drama performance, and within the lessons, there's then links to resources about how you might pull together a drama performance and what might be involved. I mean, there's another one I've got up here called "How Many People Is Too Many," and in that, it leads to a debate. And so obviously, you can't just presume that children understand or that even a teacher knows how to chair and manage a debate. So there's some resources here linked on how to use a parliamentary debate technique and what the rules and roles are. And that's something
Yeah.
sort of explicit.
I think that's a really great part of it. For example, one of the questions that I've recently done was, "Do people in other countries matter?"
Mhm.
And the final assessment outcome for that was storytelling. And this is a history kind of big question that I've been putting together. And actually, the power of storytelling and kind of understanding about kind of ancient and oral histories is so integrated within history, but actually, it's not necessarily the norm and the way that we would expect for a young person to be assessed and for them to show off the knowledge and the things that they've learned. So I think that actually, by having these kind of more creative and exciting ways for students to prove to themselves and to obviously prove to their teachers and kind of families and community that they've learned these things. I just think it's such an exciting kind of way for them to prove that.
So we've talked about Key Stage 2 and the way that the cross-curricular approach comes about maybe more naturally because you've got one teacher covering a variety of subjects. But how then have we gone about translating this for Key Stage 3?
So Key Stage 3, we have decided that there would always be two subjects that answer this big question. And I think that's really powerful because, again, how we mentioned earlier, that sometimes subjects, as soon as you get to secondary school, can end up being quite segregated, that actually having this kind of overlap really allows students to have this kind of crossover and of their knowledge and their thinking, and to be able to see those connections, I think is a really important skill that they need to have for the future. So, for example, we've got a question: how important is play? The two subjects that are within this question are English and history. And so again, it kind of really offers these two different kind of subject perspectives on the same question, which I think is largely not done in schools. I think I experienced, because I taught history and RE at Key Stage 3, I would often see kind of huge connections between the things I was teaching, and I could really explicitly make those links for students because I taught both subjects. But largely that's not the experience of secondary teachers, is that they're very kind of they're subject specific, and that's brilliant in so many senses, but it also means that we don't always know what's happening with students on the other side of the school, and actually that's potentially harmful, because actually they don't have the opportunity to learn in this kind of broader way that could really enlighten them and kind of teach them brilliant skills.
I
Um,
can I jump in, because I think my experience as well is I've always worked in secondary schools where there's always been the intention that we would work in a cross-curricular approach, and oh yeah, best practice is let's share what we're teaching and make sure that it aligns and all these sorts of things. And even we'd get to the point where maybe heads of department would meet, we would do some sort of shared planning, we'd tell each other what we were doing, but we never quite got to the step where it properly aligned. And it feels like using the climate and nature crisis as a sort of a medium, like a mechanism to do that, to say, look, there's this issue which is so fundamental. We need to be doing this interconnection, this kind of yeah, cross-curricular approach, and let's use it for that. And I guess what we're also saying then is we're giving a helping hand. Like with all of this, it's a step up. It's a kind of, it's another thing just to nudge people along, that you access the website, you explore these things, and you go as two subjects, oh look, this is here ready for us to then take as inspiration and integrate into what we're doing.
yeah, absolutely. And again, I think teachers definitely they're all on the right side of what they're trying to achieve, but as we've mentioned before, the time constraints are huge, and so for these links to already exist and to be explicit for them to be able to jump on, I think is really hopeful, and hopefully makes teachers' jobs easier, and also makes learning for students kind of deeper and able to really understand the big question in a deeper context than if it had just been in one subject.
Should we jump into this one a bit more? Is there one that
Let's
you want
go
to
for
share?
it. I think let's go with how important is play.
Mm. I really like this one because it sounds such a trivial question. You're like, yeah, small children play, why do we need
Yeah,
to play? But obviously, I also understand that there are whole movements in society that are really pushing for greater levels of play, both within schools and playgrounds and spaces, even for adults to play is a really
yeah.
important part.
I totally agree. I think you could kind of imagine maybe like a year 8 class being like, why am I looking at play? But actually, I think the exciting thing of this is I think as they get through, I think they'll be pulled along and excited by the things that they're learning about. Um, and so I think, yeah, the excitement of play and what it can do for our well-being, what it can do for communities, I think is so huge. And to be honest, I hadn't read too much about it before I got into being able to research it. And that's been another really great thing to have been involved with Ministry of Eco Education for, is to learn all these things myself. Um, so I'll start with the history side of things. So with the history questions, it's kind of looking at this more like breadth study of the impact of play in childhood on society and culture. Um, and so kind of looking at maybe gender divides, looking at social class divides, looking at play around the world, and kind of using different sources and different ways in which history teachers can use historical skills to look at all of these different sources and to kind of be able to interpret the kind of data and the information that is provided. But it also kind of comes up almost to kind of relatively modern history, where it talks about how play turns digital. And I think, again, if we're thinking about ways in which we want to engage young people, actually having those conversations about things which to them are now really important to their everyday life, thinking about digital play and thinking about what play is going to look like in the future, although this is a history module, I can't help but think how they're going to take this learning outside of the classroom, and it's going to become more than just kind of the conversations they've had within the classroom. And then just to kind of scroll back up to the English side of things, this was kind of a way in which students can really delve into kind of information and persuasive devices in which how play is kind of important for us. So it talks about the kind of definition of play, how that can vary massively depending on who you're talking to, but then also talking about the right to play, which is part of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, and actually that the right to play is a childhood right. And I think that's just a really interesting thing to discuss and to understand about how these rights have come about, and how we've persuaded people to highlight the importance of play for young children. But then we kind of delve in a little bit to playing outside and the kind of the importance of outside time and the importance of play on our mental well-being and our physical well-being. There are just so many co-benefits to the importance of play. But then also I've made sure that throughout these they've got kind of reports or studies or stories or poems that kind of really bring in the kind of skills that English teachers will be looking for. So they get to kind of question how important is play, but through kind of many different kind of means, I suppose.
And with every single question, they frame a series of about 8 lessons. And the reason it's 8 lessons is because kind of on average, that's sort of how long a series of lessons runs. I mean, what we're trying to also do is have flexibility. So there's the opportunity to chop out 1 or 2 of the lessons in the series, or it could be that you could expand it. And, there's definitely more than enough material for these to be even longer if you wanted them. But again, it's that autonomy of the teacher to be able to understand what, for their context, what's going to work best.
Yeah.
The other bit I wanted to highlight was the key text as well. So each of these questions has got a book or a couple of books that are either pitched at the students, and it might be that there are extracts that could be used, or they're books, as you've kind of referenced earlier, that might be useful for a teacher to kind of extend their knowledge, or as a resource for them to rely on when they're teaching this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think these stories or these books, sorry, that have been referenced, some of them are books which you could buy. There are some that do have a link to as well. But so, for example, in Should the Rich Pay for Climate Change, it references the adventures of Robin Hood. And so I think that's a great way in which we can kind of incorporate literature that already exists into the way in which we're learning and teaching today. But then also things like The Spirit Level, which is by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, and really questions why equality is better for everybody. And that can just be a way in which you can inform your teaching, or it could be something that you then incorporate in perhaps with older year groups. And so it's about kind of you having the resources and to build your own knowledge, but also to be able to support students in their learning.
Another aspect of all of this, this thing is multi-layered. There's so much, and I think also that's one thing we need to acknowledge is in itself is still probably overwhelming for teachers. You're not going to just instantly get to grips with this. And what we often talk about with teachers is that they might take one of the series of lessons, or even look at what overlaps with what they're already doing, and use that as a stepping stone to build their confidence and to better understand the format and structure of all these sorts of things. But another thing in this is the further opportunities. And for most of the lessons, what we have is some sort of statement or question or suggestion that does what?
Well, basically, it could be that it's even just sparks a thought that a student could then have a conversation with somebody at home, or it could be something as specific as go and have a look at something to do with X, Y, Z. For example, again, just I've got the How Important is Play series open. And so this one links to screen-free time. And so it can be something that those students can pick up and do with their mates after school, or do with kind of family.
Yeah.
It could be something to do with kind of playing. The one that I really love is about playing outdoors. And so there's this scheme called Playing Out, which in the English guide, it talks about this leaflet and kind of how the language it's using to kind of persuade and advise residents to take up this scheme, but it's basically the opportunity to have to shut down your street for a few hours in a day and just have people playing out and kind of chatting in the streets. And so again, it can be something that's quite big and kind of maybe sets off a kind of a bit of a snowball effect in terms of what students are going to find out about. Or again, it could just be that they spend an extra 10 seconds to a minute thinking about something. And I think that's the real power in this column.
So rather than calling it homework, rather than it being a repetition of an activity that's already been done in the lesson or a completing of something, what we're saying is we want to extend the learning opportunities beyond the classroom in terms of the like sphere of influence, isn't it? It's saying that those children are going to go off and connect with other friends or family, and maybe that we can plant a seed that then they have a conversation about that then gets other people thinking. And it's about saying, actually, it's not just about the minds of the young people in the classroom. There's a whole wider network.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that was always one of the things I loved so much about teaching in the first place was that yes, you've got students in front of you, but how do they kind of take that information to their wider community, and whether that is kind of people that they live with, whether that's kind of groups that maybe they attend outside of school, siblings, primary school to secondary school transition and what they bring with them to their next school. But I think there's real power in you never know what's going to spark an idea for somebody. And I think that's where these, hopefully, these whole big questions, but especially these further opportunities do kind of just spark a little bit of intrigue and a little bit of excitement about finding out about something in more detail.
I think that's a key part of what we've tried to put together here as well, is there's an element of uncertainty. So there what's it like the boundaries or the limits of what we're saying is possible or can be done is quite open-ended. And for some teachers, that's quite scary as a possibility. And also for some people, it's just infuriating because people want to know what is it I need to learn, and and instead we're sort of there's these very philosophical questions that are about the young people exploring their ideas and understanding.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think depending on people's school of thought, um, the education system currently is, from my perspective, kind of keeping people quite boxed in, and they're not really having that opportunity to think outside the box and to question the way in which they're learning, the things they're learning, how they're assessed. And I think again, as a teacher, it's very difficult to also bring yourself out of that because you might think it, but the reality of having the time to make those changes, especially if there's a kind of a curriculum pressure and pressure from schools and pressure from the government. So I think to be able to have the for these questions to really push the norm, I think is quite exciting, and hopefully the way in which we can see the education system kind of adapting to the future that we'll be in.
Can we just take a step back to maybe, and something that I can bring earlier in the conversation when I edit it is also, so we've got all these inquiry questions. Like, what's the format of these questions? What's the thinking behind how they've been constructed?
So I think with the way in which these questions have been formed is to keep it incredibly open-ended, that there isn't necessarily always a right answer, that students will be able to kind of navigate their way, and it's a bit of a journey in how they get there, that actually these questions are very much formed in an open-ended way that they can follow the kind of suggestions that we've got in the kind of eight lessons that we've put together, or they could do something totally different and still be able to get to the same answer and the same ending. And I think that's a really lovely way of learning, because I think it's a way in which students perhaps have felt nervous and kind of apprehensive at getting the answer right, and maybe they don't get involved for fear of getting things wrong. Whereas actually this one hopefully will kind of create and pull out that excitement and that kind of inquisitive mind. And that's been quite purposeful in the way that we've put together these questions and the topics that we've used within that too.